7 hours after chapel, huh? Okay. Well, good evening. Good to have you all here. We've got this mic not because we feel that we're really above it all and need a mic with this half. We're hoping this gets live streamed well, and so if you're one of the parents of one of our honors students, we're glad that you joined us. The rest of you, thank you very much. This is the first of 5 honors evenings this fall. The next one is scheduled for Tuesday, the 4th of October, and then there'll be the last 3 after that. So we started this last spring. All these people on the stage, mostly, with the exception of one, were a part of things last spring, so we're looking forward to their papers this fall. This is partially based on the Honors Hour studies that they're doing over the fall, which are specialized enrichment studies they do with one of their discipline professors, and partially it has to do with just an extension of what they're learning. And it usually blends together a couple of their disciplines plus the spiritual aspect of what they're studying. And so that's the basis for these things. We have 2 honors papers tonight. One, Macy Palmer will be presenting on ability grouping in elementary classrooms. And the other will be from Paige Kercherville, who will be presenting on a topic in marketing. First, though, will be Macy. Macy Palmer is a senior in our elementary education program. She is from the great state of, I always want to say Virginia, but it's Maryland. And she is presenting tonight on ability grouping. And so, Macy, why don't you come forward and lead us through it.
Okay, thank you all for coming to the presentation today. So as Dr. Kercherville said, I'm going to be talking about ability grouping in the elementary classroom. Let's see, let's get this to work. Okay, so some courses that I've taken here at FC so far that have helped shape my research or start me thinking on this topic were Learning and Developing Child. My freshman year, I actually did a paper on enrichment methods for gifted students that I first started looking into ability grouping, and that's something that's really stuck with me the past few years that I've continued to think about, so that's what really started my thinking on this topic. But some other courses were Literacy Assessment, which I'm taking this year, Teaching Diverse Populations, and Testing and Measurement. So you might be wondering what ability grouping is if you're not in the education field. So the 2 main types that I focused on in my paper and in my research were within class ability grouping and between class ability grouping. So I'll explain what those are. So within class ability grouping, say these are my 16 4th grade students. These are just fake names. If these were the students in my class, I might make reading groups for them based on their reading level. So I might have a yellow group for students reading at a below grade level. They might be reading at a 3rd grade level even though they're in 4th grade. I might have my blue group for those who are reading at like a low to medium 4th grade level. I might have my red group for those, medium, high 4th grade level. And then I might have a green group for students who would be reading at a high 4th grade level or even a 5th or 6th grade level. So I could use these groups, as I said, for reading, and I might make other groups for other subjects like math. I'd probably switch them up a little bit. I would most likely not have the same, 4 students in the yellow group for reading and for math. Some students are super strong in some subjects but weaker in others, so this style really accounts for that. Teachers can switch up the groups based on the subject. Between class ability grouping is more on a larger scale. You might look at the whole grade across the school. So if I look at the whole 4th grade at my school, I could look at their state test scores from the previous year. I could get teacher recommendations. This would be an administrative thing if I was a principal or vice principal. You could group the lower performing students all in one class. You could have a few classes of students performing pretty average on grade level, and you could have a class for the higher performing students. You might notice that the lower performing and the higher performing classes are slightly smaller. You are naturally going to have usually less students on those extremes, but more students, performing on grade level average. And this would depend on the school, the makeup of the grade. It could even change year to year, but this might be something you might typically see. So some things that I discovered about within class ability grouping were that the groups can adjust for each subject, which I already kind of talked about a little bit. You could adjust the groups even throughout the school year. The students starting in the lowest group, or the yellow group, at the beginning of the year might move up throughout the school year as they grow in their skills. They might have had a summer where they didn't, they might not have read a whole book the entire summer, so they would come into school in the fall, kind of weaken their skills, but the time in school, if they, really focus and make a lot of progress, they might move up groups throughout the year. Or students who are English language learners, for example, could also easily, make quick progress as the year goes on and move up groups. These groups help students with collaborative learning skills because within the larger classroom, they have all the ability levels in there. So the time that they're spending within their ability groups isn't taking up the whole school day. They're spending time throughout the day, especially in other subjects like science and social studies, interacting with the students from all ability levels. So it really helps students to be able to work with those who might not be the same ability as them. They can take on different roles in the classroom, like higher achieving students might take on the role, you could call them like junior teachers. Like if you've already finished your work and you have extra time, find a student who is a little confused on the topic and help them out. And finally, this grouping style has been proven to be effective in targeting student needs, meeting the students at their ability level, and to increase academic achievement across the board for all groups. For between class ability grouping, it's been found that it's most beneficial for the low-level groups and the high-level groups as compared to the average level groups. The groups on either end tend to see more benefits from being in those groups, and there's more specific ways that they can be helped through those groups, whereas on-level students is typically just general instruction, so it's not as directly beneficial for them. It's shown moderate effects on achievement across the board, not as strong of a correlation as within class ability grouping, but there has been moderate effects shown. And then it's also important to note that this style of ability grouping can be occurring on larger scales across districts or counties. A county might test all of their third grade students and say, we're going to take the top whatever percentile, we're going to put them in their own special program for high achieving or gifted students. That's usually how it occurs. They usually don't do that for on the lower achieving end, but when the between class, or you could even look at it as between school grouping, that's usually for the higher achieving students. So both of these types of grouping can be called homogeneous grouping because within each group, the students are all performing at generally the same level. We would call just like a general class with all abilities like a heterogeneous group. So within a homogeneous group, whether it's an in-class group or a between-class group, low-level students can receive remediation and extra support. The teacher can really meet them where they're at and provide instruction maybe at a slower pace or with more scaffolding so that they're really able to understand it and build up their skills. Average level students, although I stated before, the effects for them are not as profound and they aren't really studied as much as for the other groups. It was found that average level students, when they're kind of grouped together, they tend to take a more active role in their learning and in the classroom environment. So that can be a benefit for them. And high level students, when they're grouped together, they're really ensured an academic challenge. I stated before, sometimes in a mixed level group, high achieving students could be used almost as like a peer tutor or a junior teacher, but obviously those students don't want to do that all the time. So grouping them together, sometimes you can provide enrichment activities. You could accelerate their learning even a few grade levels, really just depending on what the students need and what their ability level actually is. This issue is interesting because there has been some controversy surrounding it, especially in the past few years. These are some headlines I found. You can see a lot of them pertain to gifted programs or programs for high-achieving students in general. Some people say that these programs, grouping students by their academic ability is unfair. Some people look at the historical aspect of it and they say, selection processes for grouping students are outdated. They should be updated, or these programs should be erased altogether. There's a few different stances that people take on the issue. Some people look at it from the lens of the students who are classified in like the lower achieving or the lower ability groups. They say sometimes these students, if they're classified that way, even if the group is called the yellow reading group, or if you used like animals for the reading groups, like the cheetah reading group, their students might realize and say, oh, the teacher doesn't think I'm smart. I'm in the lowest reading group. I'm not going to try, or I'm not good at school. So some people claim that this can become like a self-fulfilling prophecy for these students and doesn't really set them up well for their academic career. It could create some social strife between the different groups if students become aware of it and if they care. Sometimes students are aware of it and they don't care. They recognize that everyone has their different strengths, and I've been noticing that in the classroom this year in my internship as well as last year. Students are really they're really kind to each other, and even if they notice differences in their strengths in some subjects and weaknesses in others, they're always very willing to help each other, and they're always very encouraging to each other, which is something very good that I've noticed. The second bullet point, others argue that these ability groups can encourage division among different lines like racial lines, social lines, economic lines. This ties into things such as the achievement gap. People will say, oh, students from a lower socioeconomic status, why are they always grouped in the lower groups? And this can tie into what I was saying earlier about, outdated selection processes, or if teachers aren't, thinking thoroughly about their decisions. This could also tie into, especially with between school groupings, it has been shown that gifted or high-achieving programs, the racial makeup tends to be majority like white and Asian students. So that really should cause teachers, administrators to reflect on what selection processes they are using. Are they using outdated standardized tests? Are they looking at teacher recommendations? Are they culturally aware of the populations that they're serving? So I think those points that people are bringing up are really important to consider, should cause teachers and administrators to consider what groups they are serving and how to best serve them. And, changes are going to be need to be made over time to reflect that. And then I kind of touched on this a little bit, but if students acknowledge the differences in the groups that they're in and they view it in a negative way, it could encourage some hostility between the groups. And especially with between class groupings, students might have limited opportunities to interact with the students in the other groups. So teachers also need to be conscious of that and work to help their students, maintain good connections with those of all ability levels. So considering all of this, few of my thoughts on how teachers and administrators might approach ability grouping would be to consider within class ability grouping as opposed to between class ability grouping. It's shown to be more beneficial for students. It's usually more feasible when looking at the school as a whole, and it's overall less controversial. It helps to strike that academic social balance by giving students the academic support that they need, but also limiting those social problems that between class ability grouping can create. Between class ability grouping, I would say, is best reserved for extreme circumstances. If you're looking at your grade and you say, we have like 10 to 15 students who are performing 2 grades above grade level, at that point you have a strong specific need. You might consider creating an advanced class for them. And something else that I thought was important was that some of the debate among ability grouping is that higher achieving students are receiving more resources, they're receiving better education than those in the more average or lower achieving groups. So teachers can take a look at what strategies are being used with the higher achieving students and work to incorporate those across all ability levels. So some of these things might be like problem-based learning or project-based learning, incorporating more creativity into the classroom, and just, branching out and thinking more creatively about ways that they can teach their students rather than just rote memorization or worksheets. And finally, I'd like to consider this from a lens of a Christian. So in the Bible, we're encouraged to be good stewards of the gifts that God has given us. And I think that ability grouping can be a way for educators to encourage their students to be good stewards of their gifts. You can tell your students that they all have the gift to learn, and they all have academic gifts in different areas. And I think that the research on ability grouping really shows that by providing students specialized instruction in certain areas can help them become better stewards of their academic gifts and really help foster their gift to learn. So that is about all I have. So.
Stick around right up here, of
Okay.
course. What we typically do at this point is ask questions of the panel, and we'll do that, and then we'll take questions from the audience. We'll welcome your questions at that time. And so, Seth, why don't we start over there with you, if you have a question or comment.
This is more just like me being curious. I know that it's super important to what you talked about, but did you see anything in your research about private school versus, because like as someone, I did homeschool, private school and public school throughout my academic life, so I'd be curious to know if there was any difference in the way people approach this concept between public schools versus private schools.
I actually did not come across any of that in my research. I feel like it might be more common in the public school setting just because private schools tend to be smaller. So within class ability grouping definitely could work, but if you only had 1 or 2 classes worth of students per grade, between class grouping might not really be feasible.
Okay, Riley, go ahead.
Considering TESOL, I'm taking TESOL right now, so when it comes to English language learners, how do you think that that would fit in with the ability grouping, or would that be a separate category as they may have the same intellectual abilities than the other kids, but they have that language barrier?
That's a good question, and it's something that I'm dealing with in my internship right now. We have English language learners in our classroom. So again, this depends on the subject, and that's why within class grouping can be helpful. English language learners might have weaker English skills, but they might be super strong in math. So they might be in your highest math group. But for reading, especially if they're newer to learning English or newer to the country in general, they might be in their own group, in the lower group, or they might even be pulled out for special ELL instruction.
Macy, just to be sure that we all have the right definition in class, so I'm sure I know. is just within a discipline, within a teacher's classroom. Between classes would be like an honors program or a track for a whole grade.
Yes, between class, you would be looking at the grade as a whole.
Right. And so that would especially isolate them from the entire grade level and really set them apart.
Yes.
Because for years, we've pulled students out of classrooms for special education, what used to be called special education, and also for enrichment studies. So that's been done for years. Just a matter if you color the groups, orange group, red group, or you have a leopard group, or what you have, a jaguar group?
I think I said cheetah, but
Cheetah.
animal
Well,
doesn't really matter.
They were really fast, whatever they were. And so regardless if you give it a color or give it an animal name, you're identifying them, which automatically, like you say, puts a light on them. And does that discourage or encourage students becomes the question. Okay, so in class, just a subject within a teacher's classroom.
Yes.
Okay. Paige? And I'd ask you, just use the mic because that's what they pick up on for the live stream.
Okay, so as far as the in-class ability grouping, I was wondering, is that like solely a teacher's decision, or is that something that can be passed down from admin where teachers have to do that? Because I know there's some things that teachers are required to do in the classroom, even though they might have a different kind of teaching method. Does that fall in that area from admin, or is that something that teachers can solely pick for themselves?
I can really only speak from my experience in the classroom at my internship this year and last year, but it seems to be like a teacher decision. So if a teacher is really opposed to ability grouping, they don't have to do it in their classroom unless the admin is encouraging it on a school level. But at least working with my cooperating teacher this year, we look at the students' test scores, we get recommendations from their previous year teachers, and we kind of see where they're performing and group them based on that.
Okay, this might be kind of a shallow observation, but I just when I was reading through, I thought it was cool how looking back at my time in school, I noticed that my teachers were doing those things in my classes.
Yeah, these are definitely practices that have been around for a while, and with the controversy, we might be seeing them start to phased out, but I think probably most of us, especially if we were in a public school setting, we might have experienced something similar.
So you were identified and you never knew it. Yeah, okay. It didn't damage you. And isn't that kind of the ideal, that you should be identifying students for that needs that they have, and you make it as unobtrusive as possible, right? Wouldn't that be the ideal?
Yeah, I mean, teachers, they shouldn't make a big deal out of it. It's really about giving the students what they need.
Yeah.
So.
All right. Chloe?
I just wanted to say, really great presentation. I love talking about all this kind of stuff. So this was very interesting to see some research on it. And one thing that kind of struck me right off the bat was when you were talking about collaborative learning. And I found myself thinking about my high school education, in which we had advanced placement classes. And when we ended up being in groups in those classes, which are ability grouped classes, but within groups within that group, I found that started to lend itself to cooperative learning instead of really collaborative learning. So, which for those of you who aren't in the education program, I'll explain that. Collaborative learning is essentially working together in a group and learning from one another. And cooperative learning is when one student in the group, each student will be like, oh, I'll take pages 1 and 2 and do those. And the second student says, oh, I'll do 3 and 4. And then they combine all of the work that they have done individually to make the whole. And I found that as we got older and started trying to kind of outsmart the system, I guess it tended to lend itself more towards that. So I wondered what your thoughts were on that, or if you had seen anything about that.
Like the difference in collaborative versus cooperative in the elementary classroom, is that what you're asking?
Yeah, just if there was anything about that in the elementary classroom, or if you think that ability grouping could possibly tend towards later in life, leading towards problems with collaborative versus cooperative learning.
Yeah, I didn't really come across anything like that in my research, and it is interesting to look at the connections from the elementary classroom through students later schooling into middle and high school, and that might be where students are more aware. It's kind of obvious if you're in a AP English versus just regular English, but I think, my stance on within class versus between class, that within class approach really strikes the balance and helps students be able to work with all students, which sets them up for success later in their school career.
You're talking about group learning, right? Okay. How many of you have ever been in a group learning atmosphere before? Okay. Yeah, and that's where typically and traditionally you have a behavior problem, a gifted student, a kid that doesn't care, and someone who wants to get through the grade, right? So one kid's out to lunch, the other kid's doing all the work, two are watching. And so that's gotten a bad name over the years. And so that collaborative learning, ideally, what they want is y'all. But that doesn't usually happen at the middle school and high school level. The point is to help each other become better students, become better learners, learn more about things, and in an enriched atmosphere. Hopefully that happens. But that could happen between or within classes probably, right? Probably depend on what you wanted.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It depends.
Okay. All right, Hannah.
Kind of like Noah's point, I was reading this and looking back at when I was in school, in like elementary school especially. I remember our classes were broken into groups based on math, and there was like sharks and like some other fish. It wasn't minnows, but it was like a smaller fish. And so stuff like that I just think is very interesting, like how obvious like groups like that can be. Like the sharks are bigger and stronger than other small little fish, and so like I remember like realizing what the groups were for. Okay, so my question is, how often do students figure out what kind of group that they've been placed in? Like, is that just something that I noticed and then like told the other kids in my group, or does it happen a lot? And how strongly does that affect different students? Because for me, I noticed and I was like, okay, like they put me in the shark math group and it didn't really have any kind of impact on me. But like, can that have, I know you touched on that a little bit, but like, can that have super long lasting impacts on students?
Yeah. I think it's hard to quantify the phenomenon since it is really social. I think student perception of it would increase as they got older. The second graders that I'm with this year, we haven't done groups too much yet, but they aren't super in tune to it. But last year when I was in 5th grade, they were a bit more aware. And the social effects, I think labels like that with like sharks, bigger fish, it makes it a lot more obvious. And I mean, we can't really discount the studies that show the negative social effects for those students grouped in the lower groups. There might not be as many studies about it, but there are things out there. And I think a lot of this stuff really just ties back to people's personal experience. If they had a poor or a negative personal experience with it growing up, they're going to tend to have a negative view of ability grouping. Just really that, discouragement they might sense from their teacher. It also really depends, the teacher should approach it correctly. Like, these are the groups where you're going to learn best, not, placing a negative view on any student groups. I hope that answers your question.
So going off of that, I was in a GT program when I was in elementary and middle school. And it was, I'm not sure how other GT programs work. I don't really, I joined it like late for how our school did it. But for us, each day of the week, a different grade would like leave their school and go to a separate building and like spend all day there. So for me, I think it ended up being Friday both years. So I was at normal school with everybody else for most of the week. And then on Fridays, our little group would get on the bus and we would go to the other school like right after the pledge, and then we would come back at the very end of the day. How does that affect like ability grouping and that kind of thing? Because obviously it was GT, so it was ability based. But we went and we talked about, like, you got to pick different kinds of things that you wanted to learn about. So I was in like a photography class and a class about bridges and architecture. How does that affect the rest of schooling and ability groups and that kind of thing?
Well, since you had that experience, you could probably speak to any social effects you experience from that. Yeah, but that would definitely be, looking at a school district as a whole, that type of grouping. And I kind of touched on this in how we might want to approach grouping. Those experiences that you got to have, like taking photography class, I feel like those, while they're great for students in gifted programs or high achieving programs, we can definitely encourage that kind of thing across the board for all students. Creativity, projects, they're beneficial for all student levels. So I think that's something that teachers should really consider and, expanding those opportunities for all students.
So the racial makeup of ability groupings is very interesting and has definitely been a hot topic in education the past few years. And I think we have come a long way, and at least the mindset towards that in the consider what are we actually testing, that is like a very hot phrase right now, and accurately so. Like, we should be thinking about those things. And one thing that was pointed out to me recently was that IQ is not measured only in English. And so if you test a student who speaks a different language in English on an IQ test, obviously they're going to score very differently than if they received the same test in their own language, which is what IQ is intended to measure: intelligence, not understanding of English. And so I wondered, just off of your research, if you saw that the makeup of ability groups and maybe especially gifted programs has been like improving and becoming more equal among races, or certain races are being represented more, or if it's kind of all just talk right now and we're still moving towards progress.
That's definitely one of the biggest issues in terms of ability grouping right now. And I think the schools or the districts that are choosing to continue with gifted programs as opposed to getting rid of them, they're keeping that at the forefront. They shouldn't be using outdated methods or just one singular method to identify students for programs. They might be looking at IQ tests. They should be administering them in different languages. They can look at teacher recommendations. They could even devise another type of test. They can, look at a student portfolio of work. There's really, I feel like these decisions and these placements, when you look at a broader spectrum of like student work examples and student data, you're able to get a more accurate picture. And I think that's what a lot of these schools and districts that are choosing to move forward with programs like this, they're really like revamping their selection processes accordingly.
Well, this goes to intent. You did this with testing last year, didn't you? Chloe did a paper last year on testing, as you all recall. And there's going to be biases in testing, and they try to eliminate them as much as possible. But you can hardly get away from the political and social questions with this. The matter of equity, like we talked about. Are you going to enforce certain standards in order to produce what you hope is a more equitable outcome? Is that fair to the students in the program or in the school? Student behavior and motivation goes right to the home and personal characteristics within the home even, and expectations. How far can you reach into that? So you have some interesting questions that come up, but at the very least, like Chloe's pointed out, they're making moves to try to make testing more fair. The intent is the intent. Now, if the intent's bad, it needs to be corrected. If the intent's not bad, we need to take a look at that. But yeah, we'll see where things go, especially as the population becomes more, not second language speaking, but certainly more, you find more Spanish and other languages spoken. Are we fairly treating students and measuring adequately where they're at so we know best how to serve them? Because that's what it comes down to, right? Are you fairly serving the students there in front of you? So, all right, Noah, you have any other admissions to make, Noah?
Chloe's first question about like AP stuff, kind of, I don't know why, but I completely forgot that there were different classes than AP classes in high school. But based on the between class ability grouping, would you say it's better for the class as a whole to just have everyone in one, like you use the example of AP English, would it be better to just have a general English and then maybe split up in that class, but have the curriculum be the same?
I think once you get to that high school level, I think AP classes or dual enrollment classes, they really do make sense because I don't know, with students moving from class to class, it's not like in elementary school where if you made between class ability groups, they're with that same group all day long. You know, they could be in their AP English class, but they might be in on grade level math class. They'll be in PE class. They'll be maybe in an art class. They'll get experience with all groups of students. So I think in high school, especially, even though I didn't look much into that in my research, I think it does make sense at that level.
Okay, so I remember in elementary school we had reading like separations. It wasn't necessarily like groups, but there were like the different letters. So like I remember there was like that competition of feeling better than other people if like I'm letter R and you're just, you know, I don't know, something before there, like B. But and just that competition that was in that. So would that tie into your ability grouping? And if so, do you think that's something that is productive that you would implement in your own classroom or not so much?
So I think what you're referencing is what we might call a DRA score. It could be like a letter or a number. I am not sure if the measurements have changed in the past few years. Chloe, if you've had any experience with that in the classroom.
I don't know that DRA has changed. I know a lot of schools used AR reading levels before
Okay.
that, and I think that is kind of slowly being phased out or changed a little bit at least.
So these are specific, like DRA or AR, as Chloe mentioned. They're specific levels based on text you would give a student. You would note their reading performance and come up with a percentage that would match to a level. So those are test scores that teachers use and are usually required to get from the students. You need to make sure they're making yearly progress and, you know, can kind of see their grade level. So students are going to be aware of that. The teacher might even, you know, give them the tests and say, you're level 16 right now, or you're level R. They might compare with each other, but usually that is data that teachers have to get, and it can be really helpful in determining reading groups.
I think all of us can agree that most ability grouping is seen in like elementary schools. I know that's most of our examples have been from when we were little. But as far as like we've talked about the different reading groups with the levels that you're in, obviously we're not learning how to read in college. But as far as upper level education, how do you think in the day-to-day classroom that ability grouping is presented, if at all, in colleges, other than, you know, obviously like honors programs or stuff like that? Do you think teachers are using that grouping in college classes?
From my experience here at FC, I haven't gone to any other college. I can't really think of a class where it was implemented. I think at the college level, most of us are here with the intent on getting a specific degree in a specific field. So it's almost difficult, and it almost wouldn't, not that it wouldn't make sense, but to have like an honors business track and a regular business track. If you're both coming out with a business degree, I'm talking separate from the honors program, it might almost just be extra work. But I think there are ways that teachers can provide enrichment for students that want it in their classes. This program is definitely a way for enrichment. But I think it would really be like a class-by-class, teacher-by-teacher basis where it would make the most sense.
We discriminate all the time. So, no, you're right about that. I mean, you get to the college level, and the point of anything like what you're describing is to prepare students to be more adequately ready for college. But once you get there, there is a uniform standard within classes. And once you get into upper division classes, you know how it works because y'all are there. You get into a seminar, it's on the student to produce good work. The professors are there to guide them and help them and steer them, but you are effectively putting together your own academic portfolio at that point. And how hard you work then, it's not relative to everybody else, it's how hard you're working is going to be how much you're going to get out of that class or that seminar. I think that's uniform across our disciplines, business, nursing, whatever it may be. So you can scrape by, C's get degrees, right? But ain't going to make for much of a portfolio at the end or preparation. And usually those things come out in the end. So you really are. You have to be self-driven. So honors programs like this are one way to give enrichment and help and elevate you a little bit further. But it's always a selective thing like this one is. Within the disciplines, it's really self-driven. And professors are there to give encouragement and help anybody that wants help. So, Seth?
Excuse me. One of the things we talk about in economics a lot is, especially in like political discourse, is the idea of equality of outcome versus equality of opportunity. And that's what I was thinking of while you were talking a lot, is the idea that like if we focus so much on the outcome being the same for all those kids, like that's not feasible. You're never going to get the same outcome for all these kids from different backgrounds who have different IQs. Like that's just not feasible. But if you're so like tunnel vision on the outcome being the same for these kids, you're hurting all of them. You're hurting the higher level kids because you're holding them back from reaching their potential, and you're hurting the lower level kids because they feel like too much is expected of them. And so I feel like maybe it's, the ability grouping is something where it's kind of a shift from the focus of equality of outcome to more like equality of opportunity. Like I want to make sure all these kids have the resources they need and the attention they need from the teachers to be the best version of themselves. So anyway, there's not really a question there. I just thought that was an interesting parallel.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And if you're first looking at ability grouping, you might get the impression that these groups, the teachers are giving more to the higher students and, leaving the on-level or lower-level students in the dust. But really, it's setting aside specific time for each group to really give them the opportunity to succeed. So I think that's really interesting.
All right, any questions, any last questions from the group here before we throw it open? Any questions from the audience? Yes, Mrs. Trigg.
I just wonder how the teachers would handle the parents when they find out what groups their kids end up in and don't like it. Because even if the second graders don't understand which grade they're in, the parents do.
Mm-hmm.
And I went to a Catholic grade school, and we had those groups, and the nuns didn't mess around with the animals and stuff. It was the high achievers, the low achievers, and the average achievers. And when we were large enough, there were 3 different classes in each grade, and everybody knew exactly where they were. And parents who were concerned about their kids learning wanted their kids to be where they were. And parents who were concerned about how does this look to everybody else were trying to get their kids hopped, from one grade to the other. And kids were trying to get themselves as they got older. Now, I don't want to be in the high group. That group has to work harder, but I want to go down to this group. I want to be with my friends. So I just wonder, like, the whole microcosm of the educational system. Like, when the teacher starts making those decisions, there's an impact from all over the place that has nothing to do with sometimes what's in the best interest of the students.
Yeah, I think that dealing with parents and families can be really intimidating a lot of the time. And if parents are concerned, like, why is my student in the lowest reading group? Teachers could, explain this is where they're going to receive extra help. If I was giving them this other book that the other group's reading, would they be able to understand it? Would they even get anything out of it? And if parents are really involved, you could say, here's something you could work on with your child at home. We're focusing on this in school. You could support us and work on it with them at home as well. And, focus or bring their attention to that they can move groups during the year. It's not a permanent thing.
No academic purgatory for you? No. You have a question?
Yes, in terms of the psychological and mental effects of ability-based grouping, did you come across in any of your research possible solutions to helping students who are mentally disturbed or who are struggling because of being group or classified?
I think one way that the teacher can help is really in how they approach the groups, not making a big deal out of it. Just, okay, yellow group, you're working on the computers right now. Red group, you're coming to read with me at the back table. Blue group, you're reading independently. Just, not making a big deal out of it. And being aware of how the students are interacting with each other in the classroom. If you're noticing students bullying each other or making snide remarks like, why are you guys reading that book? Like, we're reading this book, shutting it down, being like, we're all just doing what's best for us to learn. Like, we're all, learning new things and making progress. And that's really what's important is, not what reading level we're at, but that we're making progress and that we're improving.
And sometimes the bigger question is, within a classroom, if you don't have students pulled out for either special needs or enrichment, how do you deal with a whole classroom of 25 or 30 kids where they're at various levels? Now, I taught 7th and 8th grade for 10 years going through grad school. That's what I did. That's what others have done in this classroom or in this building. And it's pretty difficult. You got to teach to the middle. What's the middle? So you have to be able to relate to all kinds of different students and really have empathy or compassion the best you can. Because what you hit on is right. I mean, can you damage somebody by putting them in a situation that really plows them under, where they just don't think they can achieve? And on the other end, like Seth was saying, do you frustrate somebody who's just bored because you're not going nearly at the speed they want to go at? So, a lot of questions there. Everybody's looking for a one-size-fits-all in this deal, and there just isn't one. There's very few blueprints for life other than your Bible. And you can't really find one for the classroom too easily. It really comes down to this teacher in the classroom and the dynamics of that classroom. That's a good question. Anything else? Yeah, Mr. Gillian, Brian, go.
First, Macy, I just want to say how much I appreciate your presentation and your discourse. It was really wonderful.
Thank you.
I also was in public education at the secondary level for 14 years in an urban high school. There was a policy, to Paige's question earlier, there were explicit policies and push to get differentiated instruction pushed throughout the curriculum in the class. And I'm wondering about the tension, and I'm wondering what your thoughts are. I know your research focused on elementary ed, but a lot of what we were doing in secondary ed had started in elementary and worked its way up. And now I'm even seeing it in higher ed. So there's a trickling up effect that's coming. It's been coming for a long time. I'm wondering what your thoughts are about the tension between the grouping, which seems to be a physical differentiation of instruction for students by ability level, meet them where they're at and bring them up. And the controversy over that with respect to the fact that people are pushing differentiated instruction within the classroom, to Dr. Crispell's point, that you've got a room full of students, and if you're not designating them by grouping, but you're differentiating their instruction to reach each of them at their levels, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on that tension that's inherent there.
The tension between or within an individual classroom or with like
Controversy over the grouping versus the push and policy toward differentiated instruction.
Okay, so at least in our education classes here at FC, we talk about differentiation in all of them. And I think even without explicit groupings, there are, small ways that you can provide that differentiation. Just, if you're noticing students are finishing, say, oh, if you're done, here's something you can add on to your work, go above and beyond. It's, at least for me, I find it a bit easier to add on the extension than, modifying it for students who are working at a slower pace, because if everyone else is done and they're still working but you need to move on, it's a bit difficult to find that balance. So I think the groupings can be an effective way to provide that differentiation, but it's not the only way that it can be provided. I hope that at least somewhat answers your question.
It does, and I was just wondering if you found if there was any irony that you thought about in that dynamic.
So how people might be pushing for elimination of grouping, but still the differentiation. Yes, I do think that is interesting, and since it is a way to provide it, eliminating it can, it almost doesn't make sense. Yeah.
I really appreciated the way you presented the research, and your research question there was really good. Do you plan to carry on your research and your investigation?
Yes, through my honors hour work this semester, I hope to look a bit more into the controversy with this and like the definition of gifted education. How do we identify students for higher achieving or gifted programs, and how is that continuing to change over time? So I hope to look more into that this semester.
Ms. Amos, did you have your?
I was just wondering, thinking about the psychological effects and thinking about maybe elementary versus middle high school. I know you talked about you didn't really go into as much of the research about that, but just in your opinion and looking at the outcomes, what do you think? Which would be more psychologically beneficial or damaging to either group?
I think that is something interesting to think about. Once you get into the higher levels, middle and high school, the groupings and the differences, or the way that the students relate to each other, the tensions can get higher. It can get more hostile, more, inter-group conflict. And I think, especially within higher achieving groups, there can be a lot of competitiveness within those groups at the higher levels. Students in high school, competing about SAT scores and where they're, how many Ivy Leagues they got into. So I think if teachers approach it positively in the elementary school setting, it can help students deal with it better when they get older.
It's pretty interesting because so before I came here, I taught in the middle school, so I had 8th graders, and when we were not allowed to ability group or anything like that. And I had like 23 students in my class. 14 of them were categorized as developmentally insufficient, and I had to keep everything equal among all of them within that science class. So I just wondered about, thinking about the psychological effect.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I just want to give a shout out to those teachers who used to teach in a one-room schoolhouse. I can't even imagine, because they would have high school from kindergarten and wonder how they were able to manage that kind of challenge.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I think that's where you have the rote education that there was such a push against by the late 19th century, where they would just have a chalkboard, they would have their slate, they would memorize, because that's the only way you're going to manage a situation like that. And a reader, a McGuffey reader that people eventually read out of, that's the only way to manage that. You're not going to be able to use differentiated instruction the way we're talking about. So it's a different world. Of course, that's also why you had corporal punishment in schools in part too. You don't have time for any of this nonsense. And so they'd be able to take a switch to a kid if they needed to. So the world has changed quite a bit. Yeah. Any other questions before we move on? Yes, ma'am.
How do you, in your research, do you see anything as comparing ability grouping to peer help support, right? Like the one that is at a higher level that can help somebody who's struggling, sometimes breaking the instruction that way? Is your research showing you that?
I didn't come across too much of that in my research. When I did, it was generally presented in a positive light. That intergroup interaction is what they would usually call it. They would usually present it very positively. You know, it helps students learn how to work with all people, which is a very real world skill. So from personal experience, it can get tiring if the teacher demands that of certain students all the time, but it can be a useful tool if used, occasionally.
We have time for one more question, if we have one more. Yes, sir.
Did you, in your presentation, were you suggesting that we would implement this in public school systems?
Yes, a lot of the research focused on public schools. I kind of mentioned this earlier, but if a private school were, big enough and it was feasible for them, this is something it could really work either way.
And my father taught in a school system, in a public school system, and one of the biggest issues in public school systems is the lack of funding, whether that's through the state or federal regulations. And so, in order to have satisfying research and to have satisfying results to test these students, to put them in groups, did you run across any way to accomplish that and provide the funding and the resources necessary to help teachers implement ability grouping in a sufficient way with adequate research backing?
Yes, so teachers can benefit from doing their own research on this and figuring out what type of groupings they want to use, for what subjects. But a lot of the testing is mandated by the admin or by the district. So if teachers have that data already, they can put it to use by making groups.
Thank you very much. Among other things that Macy's involved in, it's not just her academic work. She is one of the legends of our cross-country team. And so just ran this past weekend, and your next meet is 24th. So remember her. This is such great weather to run in, right? So, all right. Paige Kercherville, I mentioned, is from the great state of Florida. Paige is a real Floridian. She's from Royal Palm Beach. She is in the marketing program. And she is presenting tonight something of a prospectus. Paige's work will continue on through this semester. She started a lot of this last year and is continuing on with some of the research and expanding it. The idea of social, or I always want to say environmental, social, and governmental, and that's ESG. But it's corporate social responsibility. And so she's going to present on what she's working on and also extend those thoughts out a little bit tonight. So, Paige.
Hi, so my name is Paige and I am in the marketing program. And so I'm looking at this a little differently from how I did last year. Last year, for the honors night, what I did was I kind of brought together a ton of research that I found on neuroscience and corporate social responsibility and how that's impacting marketing. And based on a lot of debate and questions that came up in that night, I found a research question that I'm looking forward to moving forward with throughout this semester and next semester as part of my honors hour. And we'll be doing a research paper through that. So first I'm going to talk about what corporate social responsibility is, and then I'm going to get into what the research question is that I'll be moving forward with for the rest of the semester. So, let's see. Corporate social responsibility is becoming a way that companies are using their ethics to their advantage, adding it to their business strategies since it impacts both sales and brand loyalty. So examples of this would look like a company saying they're going to give 10% of their money back to planting trees or towards a certain social movement. And companies that want consumers to buy into their corporate social responsibility must have a company culture that lives the responsibility rather than focusing only on sales. This ties into the lives of Christians because, as we see in the Bible, we have a God who is just and loving. And one of our goals in living a good Christian life is to walk like him. In looking at these goals, the purpose of business then becomes to give and receive shalom by participating in the community in a way that blesses people. With this becoming the goal of Christian employees, the company can show true care for consumers, not doing anything unethical against them, but rather showing the love of God through their actions and living it in a way that proves it's real and not another marketing strategy. And so in presenting this that I just said in the Florida College Honors Evening, during the Q&A session, I was shocked to find the emphasis on corporate social responsibility rather than the neuromarketing that my paper was primarily on. And more professors and students were interested in discussing the ethics of CSR. And so it was discussed whether CSR can be considered a good deed if a business benefits from it. The motives of companies were questioned, with some seeing CSR as a manipulation and a scheme by businesses. The background of the students present at the honors evening was very similar. Many were Church of Christ Christians, age 18 to 22, pursuing a college education. The main difference in the auditorium was that the students were all from different states in America. This led me to ask the question, does the U.S. region a consumer is from affect their assumptions about the motives of corporate social responsibility? And so in beginning the research for my paper, you guys don't have to read this, it's really small print, but this is a breakdown of doing different research and looking at what people have already done as far as research papers. And so essentially breaking this down, what I found is that there are various studies that examine similar questions. One study linked to the effects of human values to consumers' view of CSR, finding that values like openness to change and consumer skepticism impacted their perceptions. Another study examined how cultural values impact the consumer view of CSR, also finding that openness to change impacts CSR perceptions. It also found that cultural differences between countries moderately impact these values on CSR perceptions. Finally, there are numerous studies regarding the perceptions of CSR by global regions. One such study found that Finnish and Russian consumers have similar reactions to CSR, but different perceptions of CSR levels. Another study found a difference between China and the US, with Chinese consumers having a higher emphasis on an expectation regarding CSR. Another study compared the CSR perceptions of young adults in the US and Puerto Rico to CSR, with Puerto Ricans and Americans both having low CSR awareness. Puerto Ricans tended to emphasize the economic dimension of CSR, while Americans placed more emphasis on the legal side. Another study found that the priority CSR issues in America are energy and climate change, job creation, human rights, and consumer health, which differed slightly from European countries. So in this research, I was unable to find significant information regarding if there's a difference in how CSR efforts are perceived based on which U.S. geographical region consumers are from. It mainly focused in on comparing different countries, and there was nothing regarding if someone from Texas has a different view about CSR compared to someone from California. So this led me to decide that over the course of the fall 2022 semester, I'll conduct this research study at Florida College. Florida College is the perfect location for such a study because we have somewhat of a homogeneous population with students that are Christians, ages 18 to 22, and at the same education level with a high school diploma or a GED pursuing a college degree at the undergraduate level here. The biggest difference between students is the state that they are from. And in a small school of 500 students, students should be able to be easily grouped by region. So the regional groupings that are going to be used are based on the U.S. Census Bureau's definition of regions and divisions of the United States. And so it looks like this, and essentially what you're seeing is the traditional regions that you would imagine in your head. So the South, the West, the Midwest, and the Northeast. But then it's also going to be broken down into smaller subregions, because if you consider, Colorado versus California, they're both considered the West, but they're different. So one would be mountain and the other is Pacific. So you'll see there are 3 different groupings for the South, 2 for the West, 2 for the Midwest, and 2 for the Northeast that will be used in the study. So regarding the question of if geographical region impacts the assumptions that consumers make about the motives behind CSR, my study will look at the smaller scope of the question. The research question will be, does U.S. geographic region impact the assumptions made by Florida college students about CSR motives? The study will examine if there's a positive or negative perception of CSR in students based on the region they are from, as well as what types of CSR are most important to students in that region. So to conduct this research, I will be contacting the admissions department at Florida College to get a list of currently enrolled students from each state. I will then randomly select 2 Florida College students from each state in the continental U.S. to take part in the research study and reach out to them via email with a Google Forms survey. If the selected student doesn't respond in 3 days, I will return to the list and randomly select another student from the same state. A number will be assigned to each student in the state list, and random selection will occur through a dice roll, with the number outcome representing the student chosen. This process will be repeated until the responses of 96 students are recorded. To analyze the results, data coding will be used. All survey questions will be ranked 1 through 5 as follows, with number 1 being very unlikely as the response, number 2 being unlikely, number 3 being neutral, and number 4 being likely, and 5 being very likely. And so these would be the responses to questions as far as how would this make you feel? Would you buy this product based on them using this corporate social responsibility example? And so by coding the data, I will have numerical values to associate with the survey responses, allowing for mathematical analysis to be run. In situations where the question option means the opposite, reverse coding of the items may be used. Once the data is coded, bivariate analysis through bivariate correlation will be used to determine if there is strong positive, strong negative, or no correlation between geographical regions and the assumptions made regarding CSR motives. Since it's a non-directional hypothesis, I will use a 2-tailed t-test against a p-value of 0.05 to determine the significance of the results. If there is no correlation between where a student is from and their perceptions of CSR, then the student's responses should be similar regardless of the geographical region that they are from, or where they've spent most of their lives is what we'll be basing it on. If there is a correlation, students from the same region should provide similar responses to one another, and these responses should differ from their peers in other regions. And so the reason that this is important is because the results of this study have further implications that reach across the country. If this study were to be altered and repeated on a national scale, then companies can determine if their CSR campaigns are effective in their target audience's location, as well as which CSR efforts their consumers are going to respond best to, whether it be mainly focused on environmental or social movements or another example. And so this would impact which CSR efforts companies use when doing targeted marketing campaigns by region. And the broader question which would be used in such a study would be, is there a difference in how CSR efforts are perceived based on which U.S. geographical region consumers are from? And so that's everything regarding the study that I'll be conducting this fall. Thank you.
This is probably a fitting time to let you know where all these people are from. I didn't know we would be test rabbits, but that's okay. And some of this kind of fits with, this is a unique institution. People are from all over the country. Seth Kemple is a senior from Kansas City, Missouri, in business. Riley Everett, do you claim Ohio now?
I guess.
Basically from Ohio, so another state. Noah Eichhorn's from the Republic of Texas. Hannah Cooper is from the great state of Arkansas. Chloe Sneed is from the promised land of North Alabama. And Macy Palmer, as we said, is from Maryland. So even on this stage, we're from different places. If you were to include me, I was raised somewhere close to Canada, but I haven't lived there in 40 years, so I don't claim it anymore. I've lived in Florida much longer than you've been alive. And if I look around here, probably if we started to call out home states, there are different states. And so this is a great test environment. And so really kind of the questions we might have focused around CSR, the importance of that, or how that figures in. But we'll kind of go around and see what we're thinking about this now. So Hannah Cooper, why don't you start us?
Based on the results, you're not like in charge of a company or anything like that. But based on the results that you would find in this, if you had a company with the research that you did for your talk last semester, how would this change the way that a company does their marketing? Or would it have any kind of impact on that?
So it depends, particularly like for some companies, you're an online-based company possibly, and you're just trying to reach the entire United States, so it wouldn't have an impact in that. But say you're a local coffee shop like Felicitas in the area, and you have mainly Floridians that you're targeting. So you're basing it based off of, okay, well, Floridians care more about environmental issues than they do about this social movement. So we're going to give 10% back to the environment, and that's the CSR we're going to focus on using. And so it just changes which way you use it, because for some of us, we're going to care more about certain CSR options than others, and a company doing that might draw you to that company and make you buy something from them, which is what they're trying to do. But yeah.
So in the chart that showed your findings from all of the articles, I noticed several articles where the key finding was in relation to gender. And so I was wondering if when you do your research, are you going to be picking a male student and a female student from each state to kind of test that against the findings, since the articles that you found seem to say that CSR does affect women a little bit more than men, or are you just going to do it completely randomized?
So I haven't decided as far as that, because what's hard is there are some studies that say yes, gender affects it, and some that say no, it doesn't. And so that's what it's hard to be able to tell, but you bring that up, I'll very likely choose one male and one female randomly, just to control for that variable and keep it even. But yeah.
I think the premise of your research is very interesting, and I can't wait to read your final paper at the end of the semester and see your findings. But something that I think will be interesting is how you're surveying FC students, and we might be able to see differences among us because of where we grew up and how we might view certain things. But even though we're all from different states, a lot of us have a similar background. A lot of us grew up as Christians. So I'm just curious to see how that typically common factor might influence things, even though we come from different places. Like, even though I'm from Maryland, I might have very different views on some things than a lot of other Maryland people, because I was raised as a Christian. So I'm just curious to see how that'll all play out in your research.
Yeah, and that's what's hard, is you're trying to control for all of these variables, and that's why having us all with the same religion primarily helps with controlling with that variable. But that might also mean that when I do the test, everyone's going to have the same point of view. So in theory, it might also test to what extent our religion affects, where we place our values, it is a big part of our values, and should be the most important aspect. But where we're from is also very, very big as far as who we grew up with and the values that we picked up from those around us. Yeah.
I think at the very least it shows a pattern that you could use more broadly, like you were saying. But this focus is just on this campus. It would also be interesting to know, just in terms of age ranges, and you're just doing the college population, college age population, the faculty and staff, I bet you would have different sorts of views just based on our own experiences. This is nothing new in some ways. I mean, it really, the earliest I can remember is people did not favor, companies or alienated companies that invested in South Africa during the era of apartheid. And so that was very pronounced. You've had now some companies like Ben and Jerry's say, hey, we're not going to do much with Israel. We protest what they're doing with Palestine. So that's had a reaction. And so based on not just, geographic area, but demographics in terms of age, you probably get an interesting response too. So, but yeah, it's interesting how it's grown. Your generation's far more aware. You've been made more aware. And so it'll be a very interesting study. Noah?
So that was actually interesting, though, is in doing the research, I expected that my age demographic would care more about corporate social responsibility, but also it actually found the opposite, that in older demographics, they cared more about corporate social responsibility and keeping up with that. And that might lend more to them caring more about the legal side in comparison with the environmental side, but overall, across the board, they tended to care more.
It's interesting.
All right, this question might be just like super similar to Macy's, but how different, I know you don't have the results yet, but like, how different do you think our opinion here at FC will be, like just from the students at USF or something like that?
I think we're going to have similar views as far as things like the environment and possibly government. But I think as far as certain social movements, we're going to have very different views. And so I think that will be one area where we'll kind of be thrown off, because we will have similar views across the board, likely regardless of our region that we're from. And that will differ from students at the University of South Florida, yes.
Do you think that your small sample size from only doing 2 students per area would skew your results a little bit, or do you think that would be an accurate representation of the information?
So I'm starting with 2 just because I really don't know how many students are going to respond to emails being sent out, because students tend to be a little bad about checking their emails. But based on if I feel that the responses are skewed based on that, I can add in more students and continue to test. So starting with 2 and then potentially working my way up from there if that seems like it's causing a problem. Yeah.
Most of the questions I had have already been hit on by everybody, but I do think it's interesting that, like if you think about the political discourse, how certain companies will decide they're going to market to a certain segment of the population because that's what the people in management or administration there find to be important. And in doing so, oftentimes they alienate a whole other segment of the population that otherwise would maybe be buying their product or using their service and aren't because of, some CSR stance that they've decided to take. So I think it'll be curious to see like how Christian kids respond to things like that in particular, because we have that extra element of, religion and faith-based lifestyle that goes even beyond what, just like the simple political views of lots of different segments of people.
Yeah, definitely.
In your email, when you send it out, are you going to give some background or information about CSR, or is it just going to be the questionnaire and the things that you're asking of them? Are you going to provide some information about it for people that aren't educated to know?
Yes, so one of the question options is going to be, and when the questions haven't been developed yet, but it's going to be a question option that you select, and it's the only option there that explains what CSR is and says, check this box if you understand what this definition is. And there's also going to be other components to it where there's just going to be CSR examples in different areas, so that we can kind of gauge that, because I feel like having examples of CSR works better than kind of just giving a definition. And it'll be individualized emails too, so I can
discuss with the student individually if they have questions regarding it.
Just out of curiosity, how many of you would choose to buy or not buy based on a company's social or political or environmental stand? Do you care? Or are you just going to buy anything? Who's going to make a decision based on that? Yeah, I think a lot of people do. I think you're onto something interesting. So I'm going to go to Publix regardless. But.
I'm not sure about this because I haven't like looked at the admissions numbers, but I'm sure like a couple of the regions and stuff are going to be more represented than others. Are you going to like weight the data from the different regions to account for how big or small they are, or are you just going to take them as like just the whole body of FC students?
So I'm just going to take it, the number of FC students like as a whole shouldn't matter because I'll take the same amount from each group and weight them compared to one another. And so that will, their numbers that are coded will be averaged out and placed in a region, and they'll be basically charted on a graph, and we'll see if there's correlation or not. So it won't necessarily matter the fact that Texas has way more people than another state. But that's why I took out Hawaii and Alaska, because I don't know that we have 2 students from each of those states, and that's part of where the number 2 came from. But yeah, just going based off of that.
So I'm just wondering about the connections from your research in this research process to the field of marketing and like careers in marketing. So this like data analysis and these like statistical tests that you're running, is that, I mean, I don't know much about marketing. Is that like a super prevalent part of what people in marketing do? How does this relate to like careers in marketing?
So it depends on where you go into, because marketing is kind of like when you say like communications, it's really broad, but there is an area called market research that is literally just running statistics about things. And so that's where it ties in. And a lot of it, like we learn about different forms of surveying and sampling and that type of thing. That's why we're required to have a stats class, is because market research is so key to understanding your audience and what they want. Because if you aren't talking to them, you're not learning.
This is more of a hypothetical question, but are you, like with the data for this, with it being CSR, which is focused on like social issues and things that people generally feel strongly about or feel like an ethical need to help with, are you worried that people will just respond how they think they should answer as opposed to how they would actually act if given the opportunity to like support a company like that, like a company that says we're giving 25% of our profits this month to save the sea turtles or whatnot, you know, we're all going to be like, oh yeah, I feel like that's something that I should get behind, but then maybe when it came to practice, wouldn't actually follow through on that.
Yeah. And that's why it's taking me so long to actually come up with the research questions that we're going to ask, because I wanted to have them, but it's trying to find a balance of asking things in a certain way that you get the honest response and not the response people feel like they should give. And so I think encouraging students that the only thing that will be used as far as this data is the state that they're from will hopefully help as far as that, and just encouraging honesty as well as me just emailing them one-on-one so they feel like they can tell me honestly too. Yeah.
So we talked about how we all come from, or not all, but we all have pretty similar backgrounds here regardless of what state we're from. Do you think that maybe a survey based on like the kind of town somebody is from would have different responses based like than the one that you're doing just based on state? So somebody from the town in Arkansas where my dad grew up that has 2,000 people versus like the state capital that's got a much bigger population. Do you think those kinds of differentiations would have a bigger impact or the same kind of impact, or do you think that would affect it at all?
I think it's
possible. I think you're still hopefully going to have a good amount of similarity within the state. But I know even for Florida, I have that is the area where I live is very blue. But if you go into the center of the state, it's much more country and red versus, being in the cities. And so differing views that even come from political views that you see in different states too. So I'm hoping that that isn't a major factor, but that's definitely something that based on this research people could go forward with and comparing even within a single state for their companies.
Any last questions from you people up here? All right, how about from the floor?
Yes.
Oh, yes.
So, couple of questions. So, of course, like the question is super interesting, so I'm really, I like how you posted. Going a little bit of what some of you guys mentioned, what do you think about having somebody other than you contact and select the randomization? Because if we're saying that respondents may be a little bit ambivalent about their answers because of what they think the expectation is, even though you're doing the random choosing, you're still going to be able to kind of be able to tell who answered what. So I'm wondering if being able to separate yourself from that process can give you less of the participant expectation of that bias that can come in your answers. So that's one question. And then my other question, I'm going to ask it at the same time, so I don't know if it can help you think of it together. I think at this point, FC does have a bigger number of international students. There's a lot of them from different places, but you were mentioning a little bit between countries. So here you have students who are from a different country. Many of them do share the religion. So I wonder if that could add to something else in this question that you're wondering about.
Yes, so as far as the first question, I think a lot of that would depend on either talking to Dr. Chris Bell and seeing if he'd be willing to send it out, or even talking to the school, because I know they've sent out a number of surveys regarding, like, is this something that interests you as far as degrees opening up? And so just kind of figuring out what would be the best path as far as that, but I don't feel that I need to be involved in the sending out process. I'd be perfectly happy with passing that off if I felt like the results would come out better and more honestly. And then as far as the other question, that was something that came up in my discussion with Dr. Gilliam. The only reason I wouldn't bring it into this right now is because as far as trying to make a hopefully publishable research paper, that was the biggest thing he told me, is it needs to stay very concise and to the point and have a good research question. So that's something that I could build off of later and compare students that are from America versus other countries. But since there's different studies looking at comparison between other countries, I'm going to focus on within America for the scope of this study.
Not to discriminate against Colombians at all.
I understand. I was thinking
Yeah.
of like religion as a common
Right.
characteristic across that.
Right. And I think to make it as blind as possible is always the best practice. So we will talk about that, Dr. Gilliam and I. And I don't know, maybe we'll farm it out to somebody. Give it to Noah. He'll do it. No, that's a good idea. You always want to make it as unbiased as possible as you get the data. Other questions? Mrs. Trigg?
When you give examples, are you going to connect a company? Because I'm wondering how you would sort their positive, like I love Hobby Lobby and I go there because, or I love Chick-fil-A, when you give examples, will you just have it like a general or this particular company's?
Yeah. So as of right now, I had planned to do it based off of company examples because it's easy to pull out, like, Coca-Cola planting trees to kind of combat how they're having plastic and that type of thing. But you bring up a good point as far as that I'll have to talk to Dr. Gilliam and consider is removing the company name as far as those examples. Yeah.
Yes, sir.
I just had a quick question about like the logistics of finding students, because you said one that you want to do it by like how they would classify themselves as where they come from in the regions, because like at least for myself, like I kind of was born and raised in California, but then you said that you get these students in their regions from like admissions, but if I showed up on an admissions list, I show up under Colorado, even though if I had to guess, I was probably more impacted by the California region, which while they're still in like the West, the subgroup then is different between Mountain and Pacific. So how will you figure that out? Will you have to like add another question, or like how will you logistically figure out what region you're pulling from?
And so using the admissions responses will just be kind of like the baseline starter for it. And one of the questions will be to state where you feel you spent your formative years as far as learning and growing and developing your values. And so that'll become more of a concise question and more fleshed out. But the students won't know, hey, I picked you because it says you're from Arizona. It'll just say, hey, you were chosen for this. Please fill out this questionnaire. And based on your responses, say you were picked because you're from California, but in your response you say Colorado, then I'd adjust for that and randomly select another California student to fill that gap who claims that they spent their formative years in California over another state.
Anything else? Yes, sir.
Thank you for sharing this. It sounds very interesting. I'm sorry I missed your neuroscience talk last year, because that's extremely interesting as well. In terms of thinking about the research and the focus of the research, are you going to be seeking what the students' perceptions are in terms of who is good at CSR or why they're doing it? And getting to the motive piece of it, and is that the premise? Is your premise that students will care more about why they're doing it or if they're doing it? And how do you think you're going to approach that in terms of the questions?
So it's going to focus more into, and it'll be worded better, but essentially, do you feel like they're doing this out of good motives? And do you feel like this is a good thing that they are doing? Because what came up in the last night was essentially, okay, if you're claiming this, but should you just not be claiming that, well, I'm donating to help the trees, because then it kind of takes away from the good deed that you're doing. And so kind of fleshing that out as far as if students believe that, okay, well, this company is doing a great thing by doing this CSR, and I believe their heart is good, and with that, they're doing a good thing, versus, I kind of am skeptical that they're doing this for the right reasons, and I don't care that they're spending this money in this. And so it's kind of looking more at that.
I think that's where some of the questions were last spring that you're kind of getting to here. How genuine are these companies? Are they really, truly seeking to do good with their profits or not? And can a Christian, as a marketer, in all good conscience, work for a company like that, unless they know everything? Because the ideal is what you described at the outset. A Christian-owned company that certainly is going to do what they say and stand up for good things. So yeah, I think this didn't anticipate it, but this is what we get from these things. Questions generate other research, which kind of is the way of academic rigor sometimes. So, any other questions, comments? No? Oh, very good. Well, thank you very much, Paige. We do appreciate you being here tonight. Again, this is the first of our 5 honors evenings for the fall. I do want to mention there are people behind the scenes and people in front of the scenes and elsewhere that help with these things. This is impossible without a group of faculty that work hard with the honors program. And so Dr. Stafford and Dr. Dilbeck and Mrs. Witherington and Mr. Chandler and Dr. Gilliam all work hard, either with honors hours work or on the honors committee. So their work is central to all this, and faculty generally that support this. So we appreciate that. And then the students that are a part of it. Without you all, it just doesn't work. This is just a representative body. This isn't the whole honors program. We'll be adding anywhere up to 10 new students for the spring semester. We're in the middle of an admissions process now for that. And so we hope to have a group of going on 25 students or more come the spring. So it's a growing program. We appreciate you being here tonight to share in some of this. And I appreciate very much again Macy for her work. And also, boy, that was going through the slides, wasn't it? Going through your research quickly. And also Paige for her work. And I will say one last thing. Some of you are very interested in this. Any faculty or students that want a copy of the honors papers, just contact me directly. I can send you an electronic copy. So, and we're all looking forward to Paige's work at the end of the semester, since this is just something of a prospectus, but a very interesting one. So thank you again for being here. Appreciate again your presence, your time, and we'll stand dismissed. Thank you.